The DS Legend of Zelda games are games I spent countless hours playing during my childhood years. I brought my DS with me wherever I went and almost always played both Spirit Tracks and Phantom Hourglass in my downtime. And with my most recent replaying of both, I believe that both are strong contenders for best Zelda games of all time. I'm not going to be covering Phantom Hourglass in this video, but instead, I will be reviewing its sequel, The Legend of Zelda Spirit Tracks, and why you should give it a try. This game follows the adventures of Link. No, not that Link, not him either, but this Link's grandson. Following the events of Wind Waker and Phantom Hourglass, Tetra and Link settle down in a new land protected by the Locomos to rebuild the now sunken Kingdom of Hyrule, which they then dub New Hyrule. A century later, evil forces arise with the goal of reviving their master Miletus. They first strip the world of all Spirit Tracks, which acted as chains to his imprisonment, and separate Zelda's spear from her body to use as a vessel for their master. By this point, the game truly begins. Immediately, the game throws you into the meat and potatoes of all Zelda games, their dungeons. There's way too much to discuss about the Tower of Spirits in this video, otherwise this review would be twice as long, so I'll touch on the most important aspects of it instead. The Tower of Spirits reinvents the concept of the Temple of the Ocean King from Phantom Hourglass as a huge dungeon you return to after each major section of the game, but without any of the inconvenience or annoyance of having to clear the same floors you've already completed previously to progress deeper within it. Instead, it divides these sections into groups, with a staircase leading to the start of each section, saving you minutes worth of backtracking through its 30+ floors. But that's not all. Previously, in the Temple of the Ocean King, each section felt more like an extension of the main dungeons by having you use the items you obtained from beating them for similar puzzles. But the Tower of Spirits differentiates itself from the main dungeons by adding on to this formula, incorporating Zelda's ability to take control of the Phantoms, with each major section introducing a new Phantom type with unique abilities. The first type of Phantom you come across has no unique abilities, only allowing you to command Zelda to perform universal actions such as attacking enemies, choosing where she should go, talking to other Phantoms for hints, and jumping on top of her shield to reach previously impossible heights. The next Phantom you come across during your first return trip from the first major dungeon has the ability to light the area around you and torches. The one after can warp to phantomize around the floor you're on, and the last of them can turn into a boulder to smash through obstacles and decimate enemies in its path. However, you lose the ability to jump on Zelda's shield. One of the major issues I have with this section of the game, however, is that Zelda feels much too slow. There were times when I was playing through the game and I would cover an entire floor before Zelda was even halfway through it. This wouldn't really even be an issue either if not for the fact that you must wait for Zelda before proceeding to the next floor. It also doesn't help that her pathing can get confused at times when trying to use the call feature or when moving too quickly through a floor, leading her to running into walls trying to reach Link, forcing you to manually draw a path around whatever obstacle she's stuck on. My one final gripe has to do with the final visit to the tower. Let's say that on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 is brain dead easy and 10 is fairly difficult. For a vast majority of the game, and not just the Tower of Spirits, the difficulty feels like a 3 to 4, which is understandable for a game targeting a younger audience. But the last visit to the Tower of Spirits bumps it up to what felt like a 6.5. Now, I'm not complaining about the difficulty because it wasn't fun, by the way, but more so because there wasn't any gradual build-up to prepare the player for that. What also sucks is that whenever you die at this part of the game, it starts you at the very bottom of the tower, with no quick blue warp to bring you back, forcing you to climb all the way up the stairs, take the blue warp at the top, climb another set of stairs, and descend all the way back down to where you last were, leading to frustration if you happen to die. Moving on for the Tower of Spirits, let's talk about the Overworld. The land of New Hyrule is split into 5 separate realms. The Forest Realm in which you start the game, the Snow Realm which you visit second, the Ocean Realm third, the Fire Realm fourth, and finally, the Sand Realm which resides between the Ocean and Fire Realms. At the beginning of the game, you only have limited access within the Forest Realm. However, as you clear not only the Tower of Spirits, but the mainline dungeons, you are granted more and more access to not only the realm in which the current dungeon resides, but the world as a whole. Among these realms, you'll encounter its inhabitants, which include the Gorons, a fisherman tribe, Hylians, and to my surprise, the return of the Inuki. You may spot a few character models carried over from Phantom Hourglass as a result of its initially short planned production time, but every character feels distinct from its predecessors, a characteristic of Majora's Mask I'm glad carried over to this game. Hell, even Linebeck's model got reused to represent his grandson, Linebeck III, who was passed down his grandfather's knack for treasure hunting, leading him to run a trading outpost in the southeastern section of the Forest Realm, upselling anyone who dares set foot in his shop. You'll find upon conversing with many of the NPCs in the game that it doesn't take itself too seriously, leading to some of the wittiest dialogue I've ever had the pleasure of reading in a Zelda game, genuinely making me laugh out loud at times, which no other Zelda game has come close to doing save for Phantom Hourglass, because Limbeck's sole purpose was comic relief. Instead, Zelda takes on this role, taking her emotions out on Link as he is one of the very few people who could see, let alone hear her at all. What really shocked me when replaying the game after all these years was just how amazing the environments looked despite the hardware limitations the DS posed. And the soundtrack for the game perfectly encapsulates the mood of every area you visit. There wasn't a single time that I can recall where the music felt out of place or just wasn't pleasant to listen to at all. And can we talk about just how beautiful the ocean realm is? Not only is it initially impressive looking for a DS title, but once you dive beneath the surface of its waters, you're greeted with what I believe to be the most beautiful scenery of any DS or 3DS title to date. Unfortunately, as much time as they spent creating this world and its inhabitants, I never had a real reason to return to any location I visited previously outside of potentially 100%ing the game. The few areas that I did bother to come back to and explore didn't make me feel like I was adequately rewarded for the journey back, with the reward being either rupees or a stamp when I did. This is very unusual to me, especially as the previous game, Phantom Hourglass, gave me plenty of reasons to explore the world outside of the story, with the spirit gems being spread about with the potential to upgrade my sword in different ways. It also didn't help that overworld travel was at times unbearably slow. This starts to become less of a problem later on as you unlock more and more warp gates, but until about halfway through the game, getting from one end of a realm to the other can take up multiple minutes. This slow overworld travel also led to unrelenting overworld combat that I quickly got bored of as the combat never differed. It would have been nice to have a different way to combat all the overworld enemies rather than just tapping them on the screen, or being able to buy something from one of the shops to completely avoid combat in general, similarly to how Repel acts in the Pokemon games. Speaking of the shops, I never had any reason to buy items from any of them throughout the time I spent playing the game, save for the bomb bag the Beetle sold and a quiver that a Goron sold in his shop. It also didn't help that the prices of everything were way higher than I feel they should have been. Phantom Hourglass had what I thought was the perfect ratio of rupees gained to rupees spent, but this ratio felt extremely unbalanced in favor of rupees spent in Spirit Tracks, which is highly unusual when a vast majority of Zelda games give you far more rupees than you can even spend. This also ties back into the low incentives of revisiting old areas, as when I did return to explore a previously inaccessible area, I was given 20 rupees a vast majority of the time, whereas in Phantom Hourglass, the worst I could expect was 100 rupees. Spirit Tracks also tried to replicate the utility of the Ocarina from Ocarina of Time by teaching you songs that could trigger different events within the world by playing them on the Spirit Flute. This idea started off strong, but as I played the game more and more, I found that the only song I ever really used was the Song of Awakening whenever I wanted to see what a Gossip Stone had to say. Granted, I did completely forget about the Song of Healing, which heals you to max only once per dungeon, and had I remembered it, I would have used it plenty of times. The Song of Discovery is supposed to be the replacement for the shovel from Phantom Hourglass, but takes way more effort than I cared for compared to the shovel, which was simply just point and click. The Song of Light is used to trigger lasers which activate doors or other obstacles as you go through the game, but is so rarely utilized that the one time in the main story when it was required, I had already long forgot about it and wandered around aimlessly trying to find a solution to the puzzle until I gave in and googled the solution. I can't say much about the last song, the Song of Birds, as it's used more for exploration, and I already explained why I didn't do much of that, but what I can say is that outside of its initial use, it isn't required to beat the game. It's supposed to attract birds to Link, which carry a bar the Link can latch onto with the whip, and it's also supposed to attract nearby Cuckoos to him too. A small thing that I missed from Phantom Hourglass, and I feel like I'm likely in the minority on this, which is why I won't be counting this against the game, is how often the game requires you to use the ability to draw on the map. It definitely has its moments, like in the Ocean Temple when you need to memorize the order in which to put the swords in the statues' mouths, or in the Tower of Spirits when you're given the chance to draw the layout of the floor yourself in the pitch black rooms, or even in the Anuki village when you need to create pairings for the Anuki. In Phantom Hourglass, however, it felt like I was constantly bringing up the map to take notes or mark interesting areas to return to later, to the point where I was doing it subconsciously. Now let's talk about the dungeons. Besides the Tower of Spirits, there are 5 main dungeons and a boss gauntlet within Castletown. Each dungeon, of course, introduces a new or returning item for the player to add to their tool belt. Immediately within the first dungeon, the game introduces a brand new item into the series, the Whirlwind. By blowing into the microphone, Link can send a gust of wind in whatever direction he is currently facing. This gust of wind is capable of doing many things, such as picking up and moving keys and small enemies, sending projectiles back to their sender, blowing away poisonous clouds, and putting out flames. And its dungeon perfectly utilizes all of these aspects to its fullest, even when fighting the boss of this dungeon, as the only way you can damage the boss is by sending an enemy called the Blastworm back to the boss as it flies by, which starts the damage phase. Its utility doesn't just end within its own dungeon, however. I found myself using the Whirlwind far more often than I would have ever expected, not only in the Overworld, but in other dungeons as well. The next dungeon in line is the Snow Temple, an ice space dungeon, and its entire gimmick revolves around 3 bells you need to find and return to the central room of the dungeon in order to play a melody that will open the door leading to the boss. It gives you one of these bells instantly, having you play a simple 2-note song to open the door to the east, which takes you directly to the boomerang. It was no surprise to see its return either, thanks to the rework it got from Phantom Hourglass. It went from being a far less interesting hookshot to one of my favorite items within the entire series due to the multitude of unique ways you can now utilize it. It still retains all of its changes from Phantom Hourglass, like being able to draw its path, its ability to light torches, activate switches, and stun enemies as you would expect, but it also gained a minor yet neat addition to it within this dungeon. See, there's a few rooms flooded with water that Link is unable to traverse, due to not being able to swim. In one of these rooms, you must utilize the Whirlwind to push Link around the room while he sits atop a box. In every other room, however, Link must use the boomerang to carry the newly introduced Ice Flame over the water. Upon contact, the boomerang will freeze the water, creating a path Link is able to not only traverse, but also push blocks over for a limited time. This dungeon's boss also perfectly utilizes the boomerang's full capabilities, both new and old. You fight 2 spirits, one of fire and one of ice. You need to get the fire or ice spirit to attack you so that it leaves its flames on the ground. Once you've done that, you need to draw a path through the flame into the opposite spirit to deal damage. The third temple you visit is appropriately named the Ocean Temple. I've already touched on it a tad, but there's much more, both good and bad, that I feel I need to cover. The Ocean Temple is the second dungeon to introduce a new item into the series in the form of the Whip. And unfortunately, the whip felt like a major downgrade from the grappling hook in Phantom Hourglass, while also being less fun to use in general. The grappling hook lets you create tight ropes across gaps, which you can also use to launch yourself up to a higher level, and allows you to swing across pitfalls. However, the whip only kept the ability to swing across pitfalls. What else does the whip offer, you may ask? Well, it can also function as a weapon with slightly longer range than your sword, but it deals much less damage in comparison. It also has the ability to pick up specific items by their handles to then throw, or, in the case of its dungeon, catch a ride across a gap or to reach a higher floor. It also has this annoying quirk where you have to be right on the edge of whatever pit you're trying to swing across to even reach the poles you want to swing from. Because of this annoyance, I oftentimes found myself dealing more damage to myself by falling into the void than the enemies around me did. I'm not quite sure why Nintendo didn't just reuse the grappling hook like they did with the boomerang and the bow, but I suppose they wanted the game to feel more like a proper sequel rather than a ROM hack. The dungeon that the whip originates from, however, is surprisingly great. There weren't any moments where I found myself bored, nor was there a solution to a puzzle that was overly complex and tedious, or much too simple. And to top it all off, the boss for this dungeon is by far my favorite boss in Spirit Tracks, even including Miletus and the Demon Train. Rather than going up a flight of stairs and immediately starting the fight like every other boss thus far, this dungeon's boss fight begins with you using the whip to climb to the top of the arena. Along the way, there will be tentacles and pitfalls in your path to the top, but you can use the whip to grab hold of the thorns on these tentacles and throw them back at the eye located in the center of them, all while toxic goop rains from the sky trying to impede your progress. This is a brilliant way of the game teaching you the mechanics of the boss fight without directly telling you, and without going through excessive trial and error, as by the time you reach the summit, you need only apply what you just learned. Up next is the Fire Temple. I haven't mentioned it yet, as it has no real bearing on the gameplay, but it really is quite a shame that Nintendo didn't give each dungeon a unique theme, especially considering the dungeon themes tend to be the most remembered parts of any Zelda game's OST. Up to this point, every dungeon Link has entered has had the same theme all the way through, but for whatever reason, the Fire Temple has a unique theme, which the Sand Temple also shares. This dungeon's item is the bow. There isn't much to say about this iteration of it other than the fact that it receives an upgrade later, but for the time being, it has the same functionality as past Zelda titles. The dungeon itself is designed pretty well, despite its fairly one-dimensional item. One particular puzzle I remember quite fondly comes from about halfway through the dungeon. You enter a room with 4 signs. These tell you the order in which to shoot the respective eye switches above for when you return here later. Seems pretty cut and dry so far, but where this puzzle becomes a lot more interesting starts with the addition of minecarts. In order to complete this puzzle and make progress, you must ride a minecart around a loop, shooting the eyes in the correct order as you pass by. This same concept, minus the eye switches, also gets reused for the boss key. You need to put the boss key in the minecart adjacent to you and ride alongside it, flipping switches for not only yourself, but also for the boss key, or else he'll fall into the lava and respawn at the very beginning. There are also a few rooms where, in order to progress further through the dungeon, you must find and bring a slab of rock with you to throw on a kind of hose that spews out magma, blocking your path. Once you do that, Link is able to safely traverse across these gaps. The boss fight at this dungeon doesn't fail to incorporate either of these mechanics either. The gimmick this time around has you shoot the glowing blisters on the boss's body, but to even do this, you need to bait the boss into smashing a rock, turning it into a slab. Next, throw the slab between you and the minecart to the right of the arena to form a bridge. Once on the minecart, Link just has to shoot every blister and his eye at the end to begin the damage phase, all while the boss attempts to stop him, rinse and repeat. This was easily my second favorite boss in the game due to its verticality, an aspect the Arbiter's Grounds boss shared, which I also happen to greatly enjoy. The final temple that Link visits is none other than the Sand Temple. Following your previous visit from the Tower of Spirits, Anjean tells you that the Sand Temple houses the legendary Bow of Light, which wields the power to expel Miletus from Zelda's body. She also says that this is by far the most treacherous of the dungeons Link has been to yet, saying that it will test all of his abilities. In reality, however, this dungeon was fairly straightforward and easy to complete, if not the easiest. And I can confidently attribute this to its dungeon item, the Sand Wand. The Sand Wand, like the Whirlwind and the Whip, is a brand new item in the Zelda series. It has the power to control sand, allowing Link to lift himself up a whole floor, but only temporarily. Outside of that, it allows you to fight these little sand monsters which can't be defeated without it. The item itself is very fun to use, but due to its extremely limited use case scenarios, it held the dungeon back. Almost all of the puzzles in the Sand Temple involved you just using the Sand Wand to manipulate the position of rocks and blocks resting in the sand to open the path forward. However, where this item truly becomes useful is in the Tower of Spirits, as it allows Zelda to traverse across the top of the sand pillars Link creates rather than sinking in them. The boss of this dungeon also felt rather tedious to fight. The concept is very similar to that of the first phase of the Arbiter's Grounds boss. You need to bring a rock, which the boss shoots at Link, and manipulate it onto a sort of catapult using the Sand Wand to launch into the boss's spine. Rather than most of the difficulty coming from fighting the boss, as you would normally expect, I struggled more with pushing the rocks into position so that I can actually damage it. And the final phase really didn't feel like much of a boss fight at all. All you need to do is trap the boss in the sand using the Sand Wand, and bring yourself up to the gem on the back of its head and attack it a couple times to defeat it. Finally, at the end of the dungeon, you are rewarded with the Bow of Light. By holding down on the screen, Link will charge up what is essentially a light arrow to shoot. I didn't try using the light arrow outside of the Tower of Spirits, so I can't really speak on its uses, but it does activate these unique eye switches which are littered around the final section of the Tower of Spirits, and likely in other parts of the overworld. One final thing that I haven't mentioned that I dislike about the dungeons, and this is true for every dungeon, is just how early you get the actual dungeon item. In every other Zelda game, you normally would get the item about halfway through the dungeon, being teased by puzzles you can't quite finish yet and with shortcuts you can't activate. But once you've fully made your way to the main item of the dungeon, it feels very rewarding doing so. In Spirit Tracks, however, you get it almost right away, usually within the first 2 to 3 rooms you visit, robbing the player of that feeling of satisfaction as there's no shortcuts or items to backtrack for usually, outside of maybe the first room. The final section of the game takes place within the Dark Realm. Inside the Dark Realm lies many of the overworld trains you've seen before, but now with a twist. Previously, Tears of Light were limited to the Tower of Spirits, but within this realm, they reside on the tracks. Collecting these Tears of Light grants the Spirit Train a brief period of boosted speed and invincibility with which you need to destroy every enemy on the tracks, essentially turning this section into a Pac-Man game. I would be lying if I said this didn't catch me off guard, but it was still fun nonetheless. Once all of these trains have been defeated, you finally get to fight the Demon Train. This boss fight was done extremely well for it to be the only boss fight to take place with the Spirit Train in mind. The idea is you need to keep parallel with the demon train and destroy different parts of it, all while avoiding obstacles in the way of the tracks and the demon train itself as it switches tracks. Once destroyed, Link and Zelda climb atop the remains of the demon train to finally battle Cole and Miletus. For this section, you need to guide Zelda along the shifting parts of the demon train while defending her from Cole, and once you make it to the end, shoot Miletus with a light arrow bringing you to the final phase. Speaking of, the final battle with Miletus harkens back to previous Zelda titles, having you essentially play tennis against the final boss. But rather than simply hitting a single ball back that increasingly speeds up, Miletus will shoot the fireballs in various formations that the player needs to prepare themselves for. With this, Nintendo added an interesting extra layer to an already winning formula for a final boss of the Zelda series, and this was a vast improvement to being not only engaging, but fun, even despite me failing at this phase constantly due to input lag present on my own hardware, but I'm not going to count that against the game. A final note about the story, which this is a minor thing, is that the story didn't feel like I had any continuity. Cole and Burn show up at the beginning of the game, wipe the land of the spirit tracks, and then we're told that we have to restore the tracks to impede Miletus' resurrection. By the end of the game, however, restoring the tracks made seemingly no difference as Miletus was resurrected anyway within Zelda's body. I don't really much care though, mostly due to this being a DS title and just how well everything else around it is executed. I was amazed by just how much content they were able to fit within the game, as well as the quality of it all, even despite its weaker hardware. The developers put a lot of love and time into making this game, and it really shows. While it may not have sold more than its predecessor, Phantom Hourglass, it was a clear upgrade from it in many ways. And with all this in mind, I'm going to give this game an 8 out of 10 rating, placing it in my top 5 favorite Zelda games. Perhaps if doing side quests had better incentives for the player, this game would have achieved a 9 out of 10, but at least Nintendo absolutely nailed everything else. Hence why I gave the game such a high score. And that brings us to the end of my review. If you liked the video, leave a like and a comment down below. It really helps the algorithm and in turn brings new people to the channel. And if you really liked the video, I would greatly appreciate it if you subscribed. Normally, I just do playthroughs of games, so this kind of content is new to me, but hopefully I did well enough to get my main points across. I'm probably not going to do this kind of content anymore going forward, as it just isn't quite for me, and it takes a lot of my time up. But with all that out of the way, I'll see you guys in the next video, and peace!